Hello everybody, it's your pal Siva here, and comics, manga, webcomics, graphic novels, other kinds of comics, short comics, I don't know. But anyway, this is something I've been doing for a lot of years. But if you don't know, somehow, I am the creator of the webcomics Lost Hearts and Mysteries of Distearia, and hopefully a third one that I will be teasing for in the next couple of videos. And I have learned quite a bit while working on them. So here are some things that I have learned over the amount of years I've been creating. I'll be going over my whole process while talking about different ways to do each step, as well as some tips for each one. Also, keep in mind, my work process is almost entirely digital and I work in color, but some of these tips will work regardless if you're drawing digitally or not, or if you're working in color. Let's get into the first step. Now, the first step that you have to consider is the story you're going to want to tell through the comic. Now, world building and story writing are a whole other field of creativity that I'll probably have to make another video for in the future. But writing for comics is a bit more specific. There are many ways that artists go about writing for their comics. For me, I like to first write an entire basic storyline. This often doesn't need more than one draft, but if it needs a whole rewrite, then I'll create a new draft. After that, I start creating the script for the dialogue and some of the actions the characters will do. Now, people tend to do this step in different ways. Some artists are really loose with their writing, some are more specific that they even mark which panels dialogue will be placed in, and some don't even write for this part at all, and some fall in between. For me, I do like having a script, so that way I don't have to worry about having to figure out about the characters, what they say, and what they do as I'm working on the pages. It also allows me to play around with different ideas and create multiple drafts, and so that way if there's anything I'm not happy with, I can always go back and change it before even starting on the comic. However, I'm not really specific. I used to write page numbers down and have the dialogue and words fall in between those, but now I only write with chapter length in mind. Doing this step also takes a good few drafts before I'm happy with it, and it's always good to just have a few drafts of anything you're writing. The main tip I have for this step, though, is to not get too stressed out with it. Some comic artists have other people write the dialogue script for them, so if you're not into the whole writing the whole thing out, you can maybe hire some help for that, and don't be afraid to ask for help or have another person read over it if you feel like you need to. Another thing to keep in mind is you might not need to write out the entire dialogue script before starting on the comic if you feel like you don't need to. Now, for me, for Lost Hearts, I did end up writing the entire dialogue script before starting on the comic, but this is because it was a short story and Lost Hearts is only a little over 100 pages long, so it was pretty easy to do that. For longer stories, though, what I tend to do is that I'll write a good few chapters, maybe 4 chapters ahead of time before working on pages. Currently in Mysteries of Distearia, I am I don't know, 4 or 5 maybe even chapters ahead of the actual chapter that I am on. But yeah, you might, if depending on how you are working, you might not need to write out the entirety of the dialogue script before beginning the pages. Some people even write a chapter ahead only, so they'll write for one chapter, then draw out that chapter, then write for the next chapter and draw out that chapter. It's a whole thing. The next step I work on is the page layouts / thumbnails. This is basically going to be your storyboards, if you will, where you draw small roughs of how each page is going to look like. You can do these digitally or traditionally, and you can even add some notes for anything you need to. I'll often use IBSP and X for this, so that way I can work on them wherever I need to. Keep in mind that your layouts don't have to stay the same, and you can always change them if you need to. For example, I had to rearrange almost all the layouts I did for Mysteries of Distearia Chapter 2 because I failed to count the pages as I was planning them and managed to create 68 pages, and I wasn't going to do 18 more pages than I did for chapter 1, which was 50, so I had to narrow it down and managed to get to 61, which is a lot, but it's not almost 70. So yeah, be sure to count as well and don't be dumb like me. This also leads me into another tip I have, which is to do your layouts in bulks of pages. This way you'll have a better idea of the flow of the pages and narrative, but you don't have to do a whole chapter's worth like I did, but it's a good idea to have a good amount thought out. That's pretty much all I have to say for this step. The next step, which is also a part of the roughs part, I suppose, is figuring out the panels and then creating them. Panels are a bit of a tricky subject since there are many ways to do them, but especially for me, it can be hard to not want to default to the same types of panels or have them not feel too boring. This is where I use some references, which for me is my manga. This is where the different styles thing comes in. When looking at Soujin style manga, I've noticed that the panel designs are pretty simple and usually don't do fancy stuff like overlapping. Naruto is a good example of this, as well as Demon Slayer, and even my favorite manga, Hoseki no Kuni, has even simpler panel designs than the other two. This isn't a bad thing at all, and is the paneling style I've actually stuck with for my comics. However, when looking at Shoujo style manga, this is completely different. The panels are very ornate, and many of them overlap each other, and each page fills the entire page rather than to the gutter lines. The biggest example of this is Sailor Moon, and Fruits Basket does this as well in later volumes. There are other styles as well, but these are just examples. Here's how I go about paneling. Like I said, I usually stick to the Soujin style of manga with simple lines and sticking to gutter lines, and I'll usually use diagonal lines for tense or action-filled scenes and straighter lines for calmer scenes. I'll also include full pages as well and some overlapping panels. To create them, I'll blow up my thumbnail to the size of a page, and then I'll usually hand draw them with shape tools. Now, Clip Studio Paint and Minibang Paint both have tools to create these, but I find that diagonal lines always turn out pixely this way. But it might also be a problem on my end. It might be that my page size might be a bit too small. I'm not sure. It just happens. Before I get to the sketch, I try to remember to work on the text and speech bubbles first, so that way I know what will most likely be covered up, although I have been considering working with a style that I've seen other comics use, which is to make the bubbles a little transparent, so that might not be as important later on, but oh well. When thinking about where your speech bubbles to go, it's important to keep in mind of spacing. You don't want a speech bubble to take up the entire space of the panel, but you don't want it to be too far away from the character speaking, unless it's a narrative text. I'll link some videos that explain this a little better, but I usually write in my text first, and then I'll often use Clip Studio Paint's speech bubble tool, specifically the freeform one, to draw my bubbles. I like to hand draw them, but it can be a bit tricky. Along with where to place them, another thing to keep in mind is how to express dialogue with them. By this I mean how the emotions of the characters is going to affect what they say. For example, a character who is talking normally will probably just need a normal round bubble, but a character who is shouting might need this spiky type bubble, and a character who is nervous might need a more wobbly bubble. These are just for talking though. For thoughts, you might want to replace the bubble tail with these circles. I do tend to find this looks a little silly, which is why I primarily use it for comedic moments. Another way I create thought bubbles is by using an airbrush instead of the speech tool to create an airy look. You don't even need to stick to just black and white, although if you work in color like me, I find it does help to make the text pop out a little more, but it depends on what you feel best fits the character and the style. Now, it's finally time to sketch the characters. There is not much to say about this step since it's about the same as sketching for any artwork, but you're making a lot more sketches. Sketches can take a while, so here's a couple of tips I have to make it go a little faster. First, use references or models when you need to. This is important, especially for action scenes and any pose you're just not familiar with. And look for places where you can reuse certain poses that you have drawn before. Don't get too crazy with that last tip though, since it can become more noticeable when you do. But if you're having trouble with a certain pose or a certain part of a character, reusing things you've drawn before can help a lot. But again, don't get too crazy with it. Another tip is to again work in bulks of pages instead of single ones. It might get a little boring though, so you might want to stick to doing a few pages at a time. That's pretty much much it for sketching, and afterwards is the step that takes the longest for me. Although I don't have much to say for the line art, this step takes a bit for me. In Distearia, it's because I usually have multiple characters in each page, and for Lost Hearts, it's because of the extra detail I add. When I create line art, I like to use a nice textured brush for the lines and use colored lines. Drawing line art becomes faster the more you work on it, and there are some ways you can create line art faster, like reusing stuff you've drawn before, but just drawing it is a little faster and cleaner and a lot less noticeable. Now, line art doesn't have to be your next step depending on the style you choose, but for me, this is the next one. Next, I'll fill in the base colors. Again, not much to say. However, if you use Clip Studio Paint, there's a really cool tool you can use from the asset library. You probably heard of it, and I'll leave it in the description, or you can search up Fill Tool in the asset library, and it should be the first one. Now, because I've never really worked in a manga style, I don't have much tips for filling anything in with screen tones, but you'll find that there are many tools for them both digitally and traditionally, so that way you don't have to hand draw everything. Now, before I add in the shading, I usually work on the backgrounds. Backgrounds on their own can be a whole separate video as well, but there are still some things I want to cover. I suggest to create some background concept designs before adding them into the comics. This will help you get a better idea of what the settings will look like and the colors. This will also help you think about where the character's heights will fall in proportion to different objects. Another thing is to make sure that you don't forget that where things were placed. For example, if there is a door behind a character in one panel, you don't want to then draw that door next to the character or on one of their sides. And the same thing applies for props and items. These are called continuity errors, and although just having a couple of them aren't really that bad, especially if you're an individual artist, it's still a good idea to keep that in mind. On the other hand, you don't need to draw detailed backgrounds for every single panel. What I do is I'll make a detailed background at first, especially if we're seeing that space the first time, but then in other panels and other pages, I'll simplify the details. Some panels don't even need stuff in the background, and for those, I just make a simple gradient. Backgrounds can also be important because they can determine what the shadows and lighting of the characters are going to look like, which leads me into shading. Now, most of these are primarily for working in color. Again, I'm not really familiar with screen tones, so if the more manga style is what you're looking for, this might not be for you. But I do have a lot more to say for this section. First, to decide what colors to use. This is why I'll work on the backgrounds first, because what I do is I'll take whatever the sky or environment color is and use a darker color for the shadows, and then I'll use a similar color as the lighting source for the highlights. It's important to keep the lighting source in mind since that will determine where the highlights and shadows will fall onto your characters and objects. The exact style of shading I use is something called cell shading, where I use a hard round brush and no blending, but I do add a little bit of soft shading. Lately, I've been foregoing using multiply layers for shadows and just use normal blending modes to create more saturated colors, although I still use them for Lost Hearts. I'll also use an airbrush tool and shade that over darker areas. Then I'll put everything, including the line art, into one folder and then add my highlights using cell shading and an airbrush tool. I do this so that way I can get a nice glowy effect and it goes over the lines, and it's really satisfying to see it go over the lines. Depending on the program, you might have to change the mode of the folder to normal. In maybe being Paint, you have to do this in order to have layers clipped to it. Clip Studio Paint, this isn't a problem, but just check your program. I'll even sometimes add some glow to the eyes, like in this scenes here. This is just how I go about shading, and it's basically a simpler style of my rendering style, but each comic has their own different shading style. For example, one comic that has a much more complex style is the TGCF, or Heaven's Official Blessing manga. By the way, please go read it. It's so pretty and the artwork is amazing. And I've talked about this story before here on this channel, so if you're into historical fantasy, love stories, especially queer ones, I recommend it. But yeah, at the end of the day, I would recommend to use a simpler style of shading, but it depends on how you want to go about it. Now for the final touches, which includes adding in a foreground, like maybe some extra objects or light rays or other things. And after all that, this is where most would stop. For me, I like creating a gradient for the rest of the page to unify everything together. After I do that, I will then go into posting. Now you might be wondering, my pages all look like this, yet on Webtoon and Tapas, they look like this. Why is that? Well, it's because I go about it in a way that's probably much harder than it needs to be. First, I'll make sure that everything except for that one gradient backdrop is in one folder. And then I'll use a selection tool and select every panel and try to make sure that overlapping speech bubbles aren't included. Copy it and paste it into a file where I keep all my Webtoon pages, and do that until every panel is in there for that page, export it all, and then post it. It's a lot, but you know, it's a way for me to be able to have full pages for physical releases as well as a readable webcomic format. So yeah. Now with that, here are some extra tips that I have. The first one is to choose a style that you know you'll be able to stick with for the comic. At the same time though, don't get too worried when you notice that your style has changed over time. It's inevitable that this will happen as you continue to grow and learn as an artist. A lot of long-running manga tends to look differently in its last volumes than it did in its first one. And for me, even the first page of Mysteries of Distearia Chapter 1 looks different than its last one. A lot of the time, style changes may lead you to want to redo pages, but this can lead you to a cycle of redoing pages over and over again to try and stick with your current style, which will make the process take much longer. Another tip which I've been talking about through the entirety of the video, to work in batches of pages rather than individual pages. I talked about this for the layouts and sketches, but you can also do this for the other steps. It can become a bit boring doing the same thing though, so you can decide how many pages you want to work on, though I definitely would recommend against working on a whole chapter's worth of pages at a time. And with that is my whole comic making process from start to finish. I hope that these tips are helpful for anyone, and if you thought the pages that I used as examples seemed interesting, they were from my original comic series, Lost Hearts and Mysteries of Distearia. Both are on Webtoon, and I started posting mysteries on Tapas as well. And keep an eye out and ears out for the possible third comic that I will be working on. If you're thinking 3 comics to work on at the same time is a lot, you're right, but I'm almost done with Lost Hearts, so it'll go back down to 2 again. Don't worry. And if you're also wondering why I'm making so many comics, well, that'll be a topic for another time. All those links will be in the description below, along with my other socials where you can see my artworks. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.